May 10th, 1945. A converted hotel in Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg. The building smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes. Across the table sat Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, former star of the Abwehr's Madrid station. The man who had once boasted to Admiral Canaris himself about the greatest spy network Nazi Germany had ever planted inside Britain. Now he was a prisoner. The British interrogator slid a photograph across the table. A small, unremarkable man, receding hairline, glasses. The kind of face you forget the moment you look away. Do you recognize this man? Kuhlenthal stared at the photograph. His hand trembled slightly. He did not recognize the face. But when the interrogator spoke the next words, the color drained from his cheeks. This is Agent Arabelle. For 4 years, Kuhlenthal had staked his career, his reputation, and his life on Agent Arabelle. He had defended this man to Berlin. He had begged for more money to fund Arabelle's network. He had personally assured the German High Command that Arabelle's intelligence was flawless. 27 agents, an entire spy ring stretching from Glasgow to Gibraltar, hundreds of detailed reports on Allied troop movements, weapons production, and invasion plans. Intelligence so valuable that 62 of Arabelle's reports were included in summaries sent directly to Adolf Hitler. And now the British interrogator was telling him something that would haunt Karl Erich Kuhlenthal for the remaining 30 years of his life. Every single agent was fictional. Every last one. Created by one man. A former chicken farmer from Barcelona named Juan Pujol Garcia, working out of a modest suburban house in North London. For British intelligence. Let that sink in for a moment. The most trusted spy network in the entire German intelligence apparatus, the network that convinced Hitler to keep 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions sitting at the Pas de Calais while Allied soldiers were storming the beaches of Normandy, was a work of fiction, a novel written in real time by a Spaniard who had never even been to Britain when he started. But here is the part that turns this story from remarkable into one of the most consequential deceptions in human history. On June 9th, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, Juan Pujol Garcia sent a single radio message to Madrid. That message traveled from Madrid to Berlin, from Berlin to the desk of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, from Keitel to Colonel General Alfred Jodl, and from Jodl to Hitler himself, sitting in his Berchtesgaden headquarters. The message said, "Normandy is a diversion. The real invasion is coming at Calais." Hitler believed it. He held back his reserves. He kept 200,000 soldiers waiting for an attack that would never come. And in those 7 weeks of paralysis, the Allies secured their foothold in France. The war in Europe was decided. One man, no gun, no army, no training, armed with nothing but imagination and an almost supernatural ability to lie. This is the full story of how a failed chicken farmer fed the entire German military machine false invasion plans for 4 straight years. And they never knew, not during the war, not when Berlin fell, not when the last Abwehr officer drew his final breath. They never knew. To understand how one man pulled off the greatest con in military history, we need to go back 4 years before D-Day, to a cramped apartment in Madrid, where a desperate Spaniard was about to make the most dangerous decision of his life, a decision the British didn't want him to make, a decision the Germans would come to regret more than any battlefield defeat. But first, you need to understand who Juan Pujol Garcia was, because nothing about this man made sense on paper, and that is precisely why it worked. Part 1. The man nobody wanted. Juan Pujol Garcia was born on February 14th, 1912, in Barcelona, Valentine's Day. A romantic birthday for a man who would spend his life seducing people into believing things that were not true. His father, also named Juan, owned a small dye factory. His mother, Mercedes, ran the household with the quiet authority of a Catalan matriarch. They were a liberal family in a country that was about to tear itself apart over politics. The young Pujol was, by his own admission, a disaster. His biographer Stefan Talti described him as a boy who spent his childhood covered in bandages after acting out wild adventures as a cowboy or an explorer. He crashed his tricycle through a plate glass window. He nearly decapitated himself during some imaginary quest. His parents didn't understand him, didn't understand why their son seemed to live more vividly inside his own head than in the real world. Pujol tried to explain it once. He said his imagination controlled his brain, and that he was powerless to stop it. Remember that detail? It will matter more than any weapon in this story. As a young man, Pujol drifted. He studied at the Royal Poultry School of Arenis de Mar. Yes, that's a real institution, making it the only formal qualification he ever earned. He managed a chicken farm. He ran a small hotel. He did his 6 months of compulsory military service in a cavalry unit, the 7th Regiment of Light Artillery, and hated every minute of it. He claimed to lack what he called the essential qualities of loyalty, generosity, and honor required for military life. In other words, by 1936, Juan Pujol Garcia was a 24-year-old chicken farmer with a wild imagination and no particular talent for anything useful, the kind of man history is supposed to forget. Then the Spanish Civil War happened, and everything changed. When the war erupted in July 1936, Spain split in two. On one side, the Republicans, a coalition of socialists, communists, and anarchists, backed by the Soviet Union. On the other, the nationalists, Francisco Franco's fascists, backed by Hitler and Mussolini. There was no middle ground. You picked a side, or a side picked you. Pujol wanted neither. He was called up to serve with the Republicans, but he'd already seen what they were capable of. His sister Elena's fiancé had been taken by Republican forces and disappeared. His mother and sister were arrested and charged with being counter-revolutionaries. A relative in a trade union managed to pull strings and free them, but the damage was done. Pujol had seen the face of one kind of totalitarianism, and he despised it. So he hid. He stayed at his girlfriend's home, dodging the draft, until a police raid caught him. He was imprisoned for a week before being freed through a nationalist resistance group called Socorro Blanco. Eventually, he was forced into Republican military service, but he immediately began plotting his escape. He waited for his moment, then crossed the lines and surrendered to the nationalists. Now he was on Franco's side, the fascists, the other face of the same ugly coin. He served with the nationalists just long enough to see that they were no better. And when the war ended in 1939, Juan Pujol Garcia could honestly claim something extraordinary. He had served in both armies during the Spanish Civil War without firing a single bullet for either side. Think about what that tells you about this man. In a war where neighbors executed neighbors, where priests were shot in the streets and villages were bombed from the air, this unassuming chicken farmer navigated between two murderous ideologies and emerged with clean hands and a burning hatred for extremism of every kind. Now picture him in early 1940. The Spanish Civil War is over. 500,000 Spaniards are dead, and across the border, something far worse is beginning. Hitler has swallowed Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. France is about to fall. Britain stands alone. Pujol watched newsreels of the German advance. He read about the bombing of Warsaw. He saw the refugees streaming across European roads, and something clicked inside that overactive imagination of his. My humanist convictions would not allow me to turn a blind eye, he wrote later. I must do something practical. I must make my contribution towards the good of humanity. Beautiful words, admirable sentiments. There was just one small problem. He had absolutely no idea how to do it. In January 1941, Pujol walked into the British Embassy in Madrid. He was 28 years old. He had no intelligence training, no military connections, no special skills beyond managing chickens, and an overactive imagination. He told the embassy staff he wanted to spy for Britain against Nazi Germany. They turned him away without an interview. He came back. They turned him away again. His wife, Araceli, a fiery woman from Lugo in Galicia, whom he had married in 1940, even tried approaching the British on his behalf. Same result. 3 times Juan Pujol Garcia offered to risk his life for the Allied cause. 3 times the British said, "No thank you, we're not interested. Go home." Now, most people would have given up. Most people would have shrugged, gone back to the chicken farm, and waited for the war to end. But Pujol was not most people. That uncontrollable imagination of his had latched onto an idea, and it would not let go. If the British wouldn't take him as a spy, he would become a German spy first. Then he would go back to the British and say, "Look what I've done. Now will you listen?" It was either the most brilliant plan in the history of espionage or the most suicidal. There was a very thin line between the two. In the spring of 1941, Pujol walked into the Abwehr office in Madrid. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, operated from an elegant building on Calle de Fernando el Santo, maintaining a thin diplomatic cover while running espionage operations across the Iberian Peninsula. Pujol had prepared his story carefully. He presented himself as a fanatically pro-Nazi Spanish government official who could travel to London on official business. He ranted about the glory of the Reich. He denounced Britain. He performed with such conviction that the Abwehr recruiter, a man named Friedrich Knapperati, decided this earnest little Spaniard might be worth a look. But the Germans weren't immediately interested either. Pujol was persistent. He came back again and again, each time with a more elaborate story, each time with more fervent pro-Nazi rhetoric. After months of repeated visits, his persistence finally wore down the Abwehr station chief, Wilhelm Leisner, who operated under the alias Gustav Lenz. Leisner passed him to his deputy, Major Karl Erich Kühlenthal. Remember that name. He is about to become the most important dupe in the history of intelligence. Kühlenthal was a complicated man. He was what the Nazis classified as a Mischling, a half-blood, because he had a Jewish grandmother. In a regime that murdered people for less, this made him permanently vulnerable. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the Abwehr chief, had managed to secure an Aryan certificate for Kühlenthal in 1941, essentially a document saying, "Ignore the Jewish blood. He's one of us." But Kühlenthal knew that paper could be revoked at any moment. He lived on the edge of acceptance, always needing to prove his worth, always desperate to deliver results that would justify his existence in an organization that should have destroyed him. This psychological pressure would make him the perfect mark. Kühlenthal was skeptical of Pujol at first, but he was also desperate. Every spy the Abwehr had sent to Britain had been captured, turned, or executed. Between September and November of 1940, fewer than 25 agents had arrived in the country, and every single one had been neutralized by MI5. The vaunted German intelligence service was completely blind inside the British Isles, and here was a Spaniard with supposed diplomatic cover who claimed he could get to Britain. Kühlenthal decided to take the chance. After a few days of rudimentary training in espionage techniques, invisible ink, coded messages, basic tradecraft, the Germans gave Pujol $3,000, a code name, Arabelle, and instructions to travel to Britain and build a spy network. On July 19, 1941, Juan Pujol Garcia left Madrid, supposedly bound for London. He never went to London. He went to Lisbon, Portugal, a neutral country, and there, in a cramped hotel room, armed with the most unlikely espionage toolkit in history, he began one of the most audacious deceptions the world has ever seen. His equipment? A blue guide to England, a tourist handbook, a Frommer's travel guide translated into Spanish, a few old British newspapers, some railway timetables, an encyclopedia, and that imagination he had never been able to control. Sitting in Portuguese cafes, studying maps he barely understood, Pujol began to construct an imaginary Britain. He invented weather patterns. He fabricated train schedules. He described troop movements in places he had never visited. He created a vocabulary of British life, ration books, blackouts, air raid warnings, all gleaned from tourist guides and whatever scraps of information drifted into neutral Lisbon. His first report to Kühlenthal was modest, general observations about British morale and weather conditions, the kind of intelligence that was impossible to verify, but easy to believe. Kühlenthal forwarded it to Berlin. The response was encouraging. Berlin wanted more. Emboldened, Pujol expanded his fiction. He invented his first sub-agent, a Portuguese businessman named Carvalho, who supposedly traveled around Britain on business and could report from different locations. Then came more agents. A pilot who flew the London-Lisbon route and could carry messages. An officer in the British military, each completely imaginary, each earning a salary from the German government. The reports grew more ambitious. Convoy movements from Liverpool, troop concentrations in Scotland, aircraft production figures. Each report carefully blended enough accurate information, gleaned from newspapers that eventually reached Lisbon, to seem credible, mixed with complete fabrications that pointed German attention in all the wrong directions. But Pujol was flying blind, and he made mistakes that should have destroyed him. He reported that the dockers in Glasgow would do anything for a litre of wine. Anyone who had spent 5 minutes in Scotland would know that dock workers drank beer, measured in pints, not litres. Wine was about as common on the Glasgow docks as palm trees. He described trains running from London to Glasgow at speeds that would have required the locomotive to break the sound barrier. He placed British Army divisions in locations that any competent map check would have revealed as physically impossible. Yet Kulenthal believed every word. Why? Because Kulenthal needed to believe. His career depended on delivering intelligence from Britain. His survival as a Mischling in the Nazi hierarchy depended on results. When a man's life depends on a thing being true, he will perform extraordinary feats of self-deception to keep believing it. And across the English Channel, something unexpected was happening. British intelligence, specifically MI5, through their ultra-intercepts of German Enigma-encoded communications, was reading Kulenthal's reports. They kept seeing references to a mysterious agent called Arabelle, who was supposedly operating inside Britain. An agent sending intelligence that was demonstrably wrong, yet was being treated as gospel by the Germans. MI5 was alarmed. Who was this agent? How had he evaded their surveillance? They launched a full-scale counterintelligence search. They checked every claim in Arabelle's reports. The answer seemed impossible. The agent wasn't in Britain at all. Someone was sitting in Lisbon, making it all up, and the Germans were paying for it. Meanwhile, Pujol was growing desperate. His deception was becoming too complex to maintain alone. He needed British help. His previous approaches had been rejected, but now he had something to offer. Proof that he was already deceiving German intelligence. In February 1942, Pujol made contact with Lieutenant Patrick Demarest, the American naval attaché in Lisbon, and presented evidence of his correspondence with the Germans. This time, he was taken seriously. The British, who had already identified the mysterious Arabelle through their ultra-intercepts, realized what they had stumbled onto. This freelance Spaniard had single-handedly infiltrated the Abwehr, built a fake spy network, and was successfully feeding the Germans disinformation, all without any training, support, or resources. After a brief but bitter dispute between MI5 and MI6 over who should handle him, Pujol was smuggled out of Lisbon. He arrived in Plymouth, England on April 24, 1942. At the docks, 2 men waited, Cyril Mills and Thomas Harris of MI5. Pujol had never set foot in Britain before. The country he had been describing to the Germans for nearly a year, its weather, its trains, its people, he was seeing for the first time. And as the cold April air hit his face, he felt something he later described as terrible cold. Cold outside and icy fear inside. Mills was his first case officer, but there was a problem. Mills spoke no Spanish. Pujol spoke almost no English. Communication was nearly impossible. Mills quickly realized this arrangement would not work. But before stepping aside, he made one crucial contribution. He suggested Pujol's codename should be changed. His previous codename, Bovril, after the drink concentrate, hardly captured the magnitude of what this man had achieved. Mills said Pujol deserved a name befitting the best actor in the world. And so Juan Pujol Garcia became Agent Garbo, named after Greta Garbo. The stage was set. The actor had his name, but the performance that would save D-Day hadn't even begun yet. Everything Pujol had done from Lisbon, the invented agents, the fabricated reports, the elaborate lies, that was just the rehearsal. The real show was about to start, and it would require a partner, a co-writer, someone who could take Pujol's raw imagination and turn it into a weapon of war. That someone was already standing at the dock, a half-Spanish art dealer's son with a talent for deception that rivaled Pujol's own. His name was Thomas Harris, and together they were about to build a factory of lies so elaborate, so convincing, so meticulously detailed that it would fool Adolf Hitler himself. But to build that factory, they first had to survive a crisis that nearly destroyed everything. A crisis that had nothing to do with the Germans, nothing to do with espionage, and everything to do with one furious Spanish woman locked in a London house with no friends, terrible food, and a husband who was never home. That crisis would come within inches of unraveling the entire operation, and with it, the Allied plan for D-Day. Part 2. The Factory of Lies. Tommy Harris was not your typical intelligence officer. Born in London on April 10, 1908, to an English father who dealt in Spanish art and a Spanish mother named Enriqueta Rodriguez, Harris grew up in Hampstead, surrounded by paintings by Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco. He spoke Spanish like a native. He understood the Spanish mind, and he possessed something that no amount of military training could provide: the soul of an artist. Before the war, Harris had continued his father's art dealing business. He collected Spanish prints, particularly those of Goya, and hosted lavish parties at his Mayfair home. His dinner guests included some of the most brilliant and dangerous minds in London: Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and a charming young man named Kim Philby. All of them would later be exposed as Soviet spies. Harris was never proven to be one of them, but his proximity to the Cambridge Five would cast a shadow over his reputation for decades to come, and his death in a suspicious car accident in Mallorca in 1964, just before WWII was set to interview him about his connections, remains one of the Cold War's unsolved mysteries. But all of that was in the future. In April 1942, Thomas Harris was simply the right man in the right place at the right time. A Spanish speaker with an artist's imagination and an intelligence officer's ruthlessness. The perfect partner for Juan Pujol Garcia. Their first meeting set the tone for everything that followed. Pujol later wrote that Harris endeared himself to me right from the start, not just from the firm way he had shaken my hand, but because he had also put his arm round my shoulders in a gesture of protection and friendship. Christopher Andrew, the authorized historian of MY5, would later describe the Garbo-Harris partnership as one of those rare partnerships between two exceptionally gifted men whose inventive genius inspired and complemented each other. They were an unlikely pair. Pujol was short, unassuming, with slicked-back dark hair and warm brown eyes that held a mischievous glint. Harris was tall, cultured, an art-world sophisticate who could discuss Goya's etchings over dinner and then spend the next 6 hours crafting intelligence deceptions. One was a chicken farmer, the other was an art dealer's son. Together, they would create one of the most important works of fiction in the 20th century. Their workplace was a modest 2-story house at 35 Crespigny Road in Hendon, North London, an unassuming 1930s suburban home that became both Pujol's residence and the nerve center of what may have been the most crucial intelligence operation of the entire war. Every day, Pujol and Harris would meet to compose messages to the Germans. And this is where the real genius of the operation becomes clear, because feeding lies to a hostile intelligence service is not like writing a novel. It is more like performing improvisational theater for an audience that will kill you if they spot a wrong note. Every message had to maintain the voice and personality of whichever fictional agent was supposedly reporting. The Swiss banker, designated Agent J2, wrote in formal, cautious prose, the kind of language a financially conservative European professional would use. The Venezuelan student, Agent J3, was enthusiastic but naive, full of eager observations and minor confusions, exactly what you would expect from a young foreigner living near a Scottish military base. The communist seaman was bitter about capitalism, but loyal to whoever was paying him. Each fake agent had a backstory, motivations, quirks. Some fell in love, some fell ill, some demanded more money, some proved disappointingly unreliable. One had a drinking problem, another was politically unreliable. All of it fiction, all of it believed. Harris understood something fundamental about deception. The lies that work best are the ones surrounded by truth. So they developed a technique that MI5 called chicken feed. Real military information, carefully selected to be either harmless or delivered too late to be useful, was mixed with crucial deceptions. The art was in the balance. Too much false information, and the Germans would grow suspicious. Too much truth, and actual damage could be done. By early 1943, Garbo's network had grown to 27 fictional agents, scattered across Britain and beyond. The characters included a Venezuelan studying in Glasgow, an indiscreet American army sergeant, a Welsh nationalist leading a group of fascists hilariously called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order in Swansea, a Gibraltarian waiter who picked up gossip from officers in military canteens, and a radio mechanic who could transmit messages directly to Madrid. An organizational chart was needed just to keep track of them all. Think about that. MI5 needed a corporate flowchart to manage fictional people, and the Germans were paying for all of them. Thousands of dollars flowing through various channels to fund agents who existed only in the imaginations of Pujol and Harris. MI5 carefully tracked every penny. The money went straight into British government coffers. The Germans were literally financing their own deception. But the real test came in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Garbo's agent on the River Clyde reported that a convoy of troop ships and warships had left port, painted in Mediterranean camouflage. The information was accurate. The convoy was real, and the letter was sent by airmail, postmarked before the landings actually occurred. Here was the trick. British intelligence deliberately delayed the letter so it would arrive too late for the Germans to act on it. The information was genuine, but useless by the time it reached Berlin. And the German response? Pure gold. Kuhlenthal wrote back, "We are sorry they arrived too late, but your last reports were magnificent." Think about the elegance of this. Garbo had sent accurate intelligence about a real military operation. It arrived too late to help the Germans, but it proved to them that Arabelle's sources were genuine. Garbo's credibility soared. The Germans didn't blame him for the delay. They blamed the postal service. His stock had never been higher. This is the moment when Kuhlenthal became completely dependent on the Arabelle network. The intelligence was so voluminous, so detailed, so apparently reliable, that he stopped trying to recruit new agents in Britain. According to the official history of British intelligence in World War II, Garbo's network was so efficient and verbose that his German handlers were overwhelmed and made no further attempts to recruit any additional spies in the UK. Let that sink in. One fake spy network became so convincing that the Germans gave up trying to build real ones. The fiction had replaced reality entirely, but Kuhlenthal was doing something that made the deception even more effective and even more dangerous. He was embellishing Garbo's reports before forwarding them to Berlin, adding details that Garbo had never provided, making the intelligence sound even more impressive than it already was. He was so desperate to please Berlin that he inflated the fiction beyond what Pujol and Harris had created. His own career anxiety, that constant fear of being exposed as a Mischling, of losing his Aryan certificate, of being sent to the Eastern Front, drove him to oversell his prize agent. Garbo played on this dependency brilliantly. Pujol later noted that the more we dictated our terms, the more they cooperated. The more arrogant and temperamental Garbo became, the more considerate they were in return. The handler had become the handled. The puppet master was being pulled by his own strings. When Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, visited Spain, Kuhlenthal was the star of the show. He boasted of his agent network, displaying particularly clever pieces of intelligence like trophies. In March 1943, Garbo had even sent the Germans a chocolate cake with an RAF training handbook baked inside, the icing reading, "With good wishes to Odette." Canaris was delighted by such ingenuity. An imaginary spy was sending real chocolate cakes with real stolen documents to prove he was a real agent. The layers of truth and fiction had become so intertwined that even MI5 sometimes had to remind themselves which parts were real. But in June 1943, the entire operation nearly came crashing down, and the threat didn't come from the Abwehr, or from a security breach, or from some brilliant German counterintelligence officer. It came from Pujol's wife. Araceli González de Pujol was 23 years old when she arrived in London in 1942. with her husband and their young son. She spoke no English. She was forbidden from contacting other Spaniards in London. MI5 couldn't risk her accidentally revealing her husband's work. The only person she could speak to in her own language was Juan, and he was almost never home. He spent his days, 6 to 8 hours, 7 days a week, at the MI5 offices, crafting his elaborate fiction. And then there was the food. Wartime British cooking, made even blander by rationing, was a special kind of torture for a Galician woman raised on Spanish cuisine. Too much macaroni, too many potatoes, not enough fish, she complained. Isolated, lonely, homesick, and bored, Araceli grew increasingly desperate. She wanted to go home. She wanted to see her mother in Spain, and she couldn't understand why her husband's work was more important than her suffering. Tommy Harris tried to help. He arranged for an MI5 agent to travel to Lisbon and purchase 12 pairs of silk stockings for Araceli. Silk was rationed in Britain for military use. It was a kind gesture, but no amount of hosiery could cure homesickness of that magnitude. On June 21st, 1943, the situation exploded. Araceli and Juan had a volcanic argument. Afterward, she picked up the telephone and called Tommy Harris. What she said nearly stopped the war effort in its tracks. "I don't want to live another 5 minutes with my husband," she screamed at Harris. "Even if they kill me, I am going to the Spanish embassy." The Spanish embassy in wartime London. Spain was officially neutral, but Franco's government was riddled with Nazi sympathizers and had deep ties to the Abwehr. If Araceli walked into that embassy and told them her husband was a double agent working for British intelligence, the entire Garbo operation would be blown. The double-cross system, the network of turned German agents that MI5 had spent years building, could be compromised. The plans for the invasion of France, still a year away, could be exposed. One angry wife, one phone call, and everything falls apart. Harris reported the crisis to his superiors. MI5 was terrified. This wasn't a problem they could solve with tradecraft or encrypted messages. This was a marital dispute with the potential to change the course of the war. And this is where Pujol's genius showed itself in a way that had nothing to do with the Germans. He came up with a plan. He convinced MI5 to stage his arrest. They would make Araceli believe that her threats had gotten her husband thrown into prison, that it was her fault, that her recklessness had destroyed everything. MI5 agreed. They called Araceli and informed her that Juan had been detained because of her behavior. The next day, an MI5 wireless operator came to her house and found her sitting in the kitchen with all the gas taps turned on. The officer believed it was a bluff, a dramatic gesture rather than a genuine suicide attempt. He estimated there was a 90% chance that this was mere play action, but no one was willing to take that 10% risk. The stakes were too high, in every sense. Araceli was taken to the MI5 Camp Interrogation Center in West London, blindfolded. When the blindfold came off, she saw her husband sitting across from her, unshaven, wearing prison clothes, looking defeated. It was an act, of course. Juan Pujol Garcia was performing the role of his life, not for the Germans this time, but for his own wife. Araceli burst into tears. She swore she had never meant what she said. She promised she would help him in every way, with even greater zeal than before. She signed a written apology, pledging that she would not do anything in future to jeopardize the work being done by her husband. The crisis passed. The operation survived. But the marriage was mortally wounded. Araceli would stay in London for the rest of the war, but the woman who had helped her husband first approach the Americans in Lisbon, the woman without whom there would have been no Agent Garbo, would never find happiness in England. After the war, she followed Juan to Venezuela, but the marriage could not be saved. By 1948, they were formally separated. Araceli returned to Spain with their 3 children. The following year, the British ambassador informed her that Juan had died of malaria in Africa. It was one final hoax, one more lie in a career built on lies. MI5 had faked Pujol's death to protect him from surviving Nazis. Juan started a new life with a new wife in Venezuela. Araceli eventually remarried too, but that was years in the future. In the summer of 1943, the only thing that mattered was that the Garbo network had survived its closest call. And now, with the crisis behind them, Pujol and Harris threw themselves into the most important work of their lives. Because the invasion of Europe was coming. The Germans knew it. The Allies knew it. The entire world knew it. The question that would decide the fate of millions was simple. Where would the Allies land? And one former chicken farmer, working in a suburban house in Hendon, was about to provide the answer. The wrong answer. Delivered so convincingly that Adolf Hitler himself would bet the future of the Third Reich on it. The deception was called Operation Fortitude, and Garbo would be at its absolute center. But before we get to the Phantom Armies and the Phantom Invasion, there is something you need to understand about the man on the other side of this equation, the man who would receive Garbo's false invasion plans and send them straight to Hitler. Because Karl Erich Kuhlenthal wasn't just gullible, he was trapped, and a trapped man will believe anything that keeps him alive. Part 3. The Phantom Army, January 1944. London was a city holding its breath. Everyone knew the invasion was coming. From the War Cabinet at Whitehall to the pubs in Piccadilly, the question wasn't whether the Allies would cross the English Channel. It was when and where. The Germans knew it too. Across the Channel, behind the concrete bunkers and barbed wire of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the Wehrmacht waited. 2 German armies defended the coast of France. The 7th Army covered Normandy. The 15th Army, larger, better equipped, guarded the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, just 21 miles from Dover to Cap Gris-Nez. Both armies were roughly 150,000 men strong. If the Germans could determine where the Allies would land and concentrate both forces against the invasion, the math was devastating. The attackers would be outnumbered, pinned against the sea, and slaughtered on the beaches. The Allies needed the 15th Army to stay at Calais. They needed the Germans to believe that Normandy, when it happened, was just a feint, a diversion. The real attack, the knockout blow, would come at the Pas de Calais. This was the task assigned to Operation Fortitude South, and it was breathtaking in scope. The plan centered on a Phantom, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. On paper, it was massive. 11 divisions, 150,000 men, tanks, artillery, supply depots, landing craft, all concentrated in southeast England, pointing like a dagger across the shortest stretch of the Channel. In reality, FUSAG was empty air. The tanks were inflatable rubber decoys that looked convincing from the air. The landing craft were wooden frames draped with canvas. The supply depots were painted plywood. The radio traffic from FUSAG headquarters was generated by a handful of signals operators pretending to be an entire army group. But the masterstroke was the commander. The Allies needed someone the Germans would believe could lead a full-scale invasion, someone the Wehrmacht respected, someone whose very presence in southeast England would scream, "The attack is coming from here." They chose General George S. Patton. Patton was the general the Germans feared most. Bold, aggressive, unpredictable, he was the antithesis of the cautious commanders the Wehrmacht had grown accustomed to outmaneuvering. And there was a bonus. Patton was actually in disgrace at the time. Sidelined after slapping a hospitalized soldier in Sicily, he was available. He had nothing else to do. So they gave him command of an army that didn't exist and told him to make it look real. Patton played the role with gusto. He was photographed touring fake camps. He attended public events in southeast England. He gave rousing speeches to troops who would never see combat under his command. The Germans monitored his movements through their few remaining intelligence sources and drew exactly the conclusion the Allies wanted them to draw. Patton was preparing to lead the main invasion force across the narrowest point of the Channel. But inflatable tanks and a famous general weren't enough. The Germans had 3 primary means of verifying what was happening in England: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and human intelligence, spies on the ground. Allied air superiority had virtually eliminated German reconnaissance flights over southern England. The signals traffic was being carefully fabricated. That left human intelligence. And that is where Garbo became indispensable. In January 1944, Kuhlenthal sent Pujol an urgent message. The Germans believed the Allies were preparing for a large-scale invasion of Europe. They needed Arabelle, their most trusted agent, to keep them informed of developments. Everything Garbo and Harris had built over 2 years was about to face its ultimate test. Between January and June 1944, the Garbo network went into overdrive. Over 500 radio messages passed between London and Madrid, at times more than 20 messages per day, 4 separate transmissions daily. Each message carefully crafted to add another layer to the deception. Agent 3, the Venezuelan student in Scotland, reported extensive military preparations in the north, supporting the fiction of Fortitude North, a supposed threat to Norway. Agent 7, a Welsh ex-seaman, described shipping concentrations in Dover. Agent 4-3, a fictional American sergeant, detailed Patton's presence in southeast England and the massive build-up of Fusag. Each report reinforced the central lie. The real invasion force was in the southeast, under Patton, aimed at Calais. What was happening in the southwest, the actual build-up of the real invasion force, was either downplayed or explained away as a secondary operation. The Germans weren't just accepting this intelligence, they were hungry for it. By 1944, the Abwehr was in crisis. Its chief, Admiral Canaris, had been forced out in February, replaced by the SS. But Kuhlenthal's Madrid station continued operating, and Arabelle remained his crown jewel. Kuhlenthal forwarded Garbo's reports to Berlin, often adding his own embellishments. Berlin forwarded the summaries to the OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command. No fewer than 62 of Garbo's reports ended up in intelligence summaries that reached the highest levels of the German military leadership, and the Allies knew this was working. Because of Ultra, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading the Germans' own intelligence assessments, encrypted with the Enigma machine and transmitted by radio. The Allies could see, in near real time, how the Germans were interpreting Garbo's reports. They could monitor the deception's effect like doctors monitoring a patient's vital signs, and the vital signs were exactly what they wanted to see. The Germans believed the Allies had 89 divisions in Britain. The real number was 47. They believed Patton commanded a massive army group in the southeast. They believed Norway was threatened by a phantom British Fourth Army in Scotland. They believed the invasion force was nearly twice its actual size, but the Allies took risks that seem almost insane in hindsight. One of the most audacious involved a real German general. General Hans Kramer, a commander of the Africa Corps, had been captured in North Africa in May 1943. Due to poor health, the Allies agreed to repatriate him to Germany through neutral Sweden. But before sending him home, they invited him to dinner with General Patton in May 1944. Picture this: a German prisoner of war sitting at dinner with the most feared Allied general, being told that Patton is commanding Fusag, hearing Patton repeatedly mention the Pas de Calais. Afterward, Kramer is driven through the English countryside on his way to deportation. He passes through towns full of actual Allied troops, real soldiers, real vehicles, real preparations. The catch? Kramer was told he was in southeast England. In reality, he was being driven through southwest England, through the heart of the actual invasion force. But the road signs had been changed. The guards casually mentioned Dover and Kent. Everything Kramer saw was real. Everything he was told about where he was seeing it was a lie. When Kramer arrived back in Germany, he reported exactly what the Allies wanted. Massive forces in southeast England, Patton in command, Calais clearly the target. His first-hand eyewitness account, combined with Garbo's agent reports, created a wall of evidence that no German analyst could break through. By late May 1944, everything was in place. The real invasion force, over 150,000 men, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, was loaded and ready in the ports of southwest England. The phantom invasion force sat inflated and quiet in the southeast. Garbo's network hummed with messages pointing to Calais. Everything was ready. The greatest military deception in history was about to reach its climax. And then a dead dog nearly destroyed it all. Garbo was the crown jewel of the double-cross system, but he wasn't the only double agent MI5 was running. Among the others was a French woman of Russian descent named Natalie Lily Sergeyev, codename Treasure. She traveled between Britain and neutral Portugal, passing information to the Abwehr, information that MI5 carefully controlled and filtered. Sergeyev was effective. She was committed. and she had one weakness that no intelligence training could account for. She loved her dog. The dog's name was Babs. When Sergeyev was brought to Britain, Babs was left behind in Gibraltar because of British quarantine regulations. MI5 promised they would take care of it. They didn't, or they couldn't, or they simply had bigger things to worry about, which in wartime is probably true. Babs died in Gibraltar. Sergeyev was devastated, and then she was furious. She blamed MI5. She believed they had deliberately let her dog die out of carelessness or indifference. In December 1943, she went on strike. She refused to transmit a single message to the Germans. Think about that timing. December 1943, 6 months before D-Day. The most complex military deception in history is being assembled, piece by painstaking piece. Every double agent is a load-bearing pillar in the structure, and one of them has stopped working because her dog died. But what happened next was far worse than a strike. In May 1944, weeks before the invasion, Sergeyev told her MI5 handler something that made the blood freeze in the veins of everyone at headquarters. She revealed that the Germans had given her a control signal, a hidden code embedded in her transmissions. If she ever activated it, the Abwehr would know immediately that she was working under British control. It was a kill switch, a single coded phrase that would tell Berlin, "This agent has been turned. She is sending you what the British want you to hear. Let that sink in. One woman, one signal, and the entire double-cross system is exposed. Every double agent, including Garbo, is instantly compromised. Every report the Germans have received from Britain is revealed as a British fabrication. Operation Fortitude collapses overnight. The real invasion plan is laid bare. Imagine you've spent 3 years building a house of cards, each card placed with surgical precision, each layer supporting the next. And now you discover that one angry person has the ability to kick the table. MI5 was terrified. They couldn't remove the control signal from her transmissions without alerting the Germans. They couldn't silence Sergeyev without creating a suspicious gap in her reporting. And they couldn't know for certain whether she had already used the signal or was waiting for the moment it would cause maximum damage. The fate of the largest amphibious invasion in human history, 150,000 men, 5,000 ships, the liberation of Europe itself, now depended on whether a grieving Frenchwoman would betray Britain because MI5 had let her dog die. They made a calculated gamble. They bet that Sergeyev, despite her rage and grief, would not pull the trigger, that her hatred of the Nazis ran deeper than her hatred of MI5, that in the end she would choose the cause over the grudge. They were right. The control signal was never activated. Treasure was quietly retired after D-Day, her usefulness too compromised by the risk she represented. But the incident reveals something profound about the architecture of deception that protected the Normandy invasion. Years of meticulous work, hundreds of carefully crafted messages, 27 fictional agents maintained with the precision of a Swiss watch, a strategic deception supporting the greatest military operation in history. All of it, every last piece, could have been destroyed by one person's grief over a dead pet. War, for all its grand strategy and sweeping movements of armies, always comes down to human beings. Fragile, emotional, unpredictable human beings. And in the spring of 1944, the Allied High Command was reminded of that truth in the most unlikely way imaginable. Treasure kept her silence. The double cross held. Garbo's network remained intact, and the stage was set for the final, most dangerous act of the entire deception. But there was one final, impossible challenge, the most delicate timing problem in the history of espionage. D-Day was approaching. The Germans would obviously know when the invasion happened. You can't hide 150,000 soldiers landing on a beach. The question was, what would Garbo tell them about it? If Garbo said nothing about the Normandy landings, the Germans would wonder why their best spy had missed the biggest military operation in history. His credibility would be destroyed. The entire network would collapse. And with it, the crucial follow-up deception. The lie that Normandy was just a diversion, and the real attack was still coming at Calais. But if Garbo warned the Germans about Normandy too early, they could reinforce the beaches, and the invasion might fail. The timing had to be perfect. Close enough to preserve credibility, late enough to be useless. Garbo and Harris devised a plan of terrifying precision. They would arrange for the German radio operators in Madrid to be listening at a specific time on the night of June 5th, using the cover story that one of Garbo's sub-agents was about to arrive with critical intelligence. Then Garbo would transmit a warning about the Normandy invasion at 3 a.m. on June 6th, after the Allied fleet had already sailed and the paratroopers were already in the air, but hours before the beach landings began. It would be too late for the Germans to react, but it would prove that Garbo had tried to warn them. His credibility would not just survive, it would be stronger than ever. There was just one problem. One devastating, unforeseeable wrinkle that nobody could have planned for. When Garbo's radio operator sent the signal at 3 a.m. on June 6, 1944, nobody answered. The German radio operators in Madrid had fallen asleep, or wandered off, or simply weren't listening. Despite explicit arrangements to maintain contact through the night, when the most important message of the war came through, there was nothing on the other end but static. For 5 agonizing hours, Garbo's team tried to make contact. At 8 a.m., the Germans finally responded. By then, Allied paratroopers had been fighting for 7 hours. The first wave of landing craft was already approaching the beaches. The warning was useless, and what happened next was either the most brilliant improvisation in the history of espionage, or the luckiest break the Allies ever got. Because Garbo's response to this failure would become the single most important message of World War II, the message that won D-Day, the message that kept 200,000 German soldiers sitting idle while the fate of the world was decided on the beaches of Normandy. But that message is coming. First, you need to understand what was happening on those beaches on the morning of June 6th, because the deception Garbo was about to pull off only works if you grasp how desperate the situation really was. The margin between victory and disaster at Normandy was razor thin, and the reinforcements that could tip that balance were sitting just 150 miles away at Calais, waiting for orders. Orders that depended on what one man in North London was about to type into a radio transmitter. Part 4. The Message That Won the War. June 6, 1944. 6:30 a.m. The first wave of American soldiers hit Omaha Beach. The water was red within minutes. Machine gun fire raked the sand from concrete bunkers that the naval bombardment had failed to destroy. Landing craft were blown apart by mines and artillery. Bodies washed in the surf. Soldiers who made it to the beach clung to obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of their boats, pinned down, terrified, dying. At Omaha, the first hour was a catastrophe. Entire companies were wiped out in the time it takes to read this sentence. The plan had called for tanks to lead the way, but most of the amphibious Sherman tanks had sunk in the rough seas, their inflatable skirts torn apart by waves. The soldiers who stumbled ashore had no armor support, no cover, and no way back. On the bluffs above, the German 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that Allied intelligence hadn't known was there, poured fire down on the beach with disciplined precision. For several terrible hours, the American commanders seriously considered abandoning Omaha and redirecting forces to the other beaches. The situation at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword was better, but nowhere was it easy, nowhere was it safe, and everywhere the same question hung in the air like smoke. What happens when the Germans send reinforcements? Because the 15th Army was still at Calais, over 200,000 men, armored divisions, panzer reserves. If Hitler released those forces and threw them at Normandy, the beachhead could be crushed, and this is where the failed 3 a.m. radio call became the most valuable mistake of the war. When contact was finally established with Madrid at 8 a.m. on June 6th, Garbo transmitted his warning about the Normandy invasion. Accurate information, real details, delivered hours too late. Then he exploded with fury. In a message dripping with indignation, Garbo raged at the incompetence of his German handlers. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence," he wrote. "Were it not for my ideals and faith, I would abandon this work as having proved myself a failure." It was a performance worthy of the name Garbo. The tone was perfect, the righteous anger of a devoted agent who had risked everything to warn his handlers, only to be let down by their carelessness. The fury was so convincing that Kuhlenthal was mortified. He sent groveling apologies to his prize agent. Berlin was embarrassed. But the brilliance of this moment goes deeper than wounded pride. By expressing outrage at the missed warning, Garbo accomplished two things simultaneously. First, he cemented his credibility. He had tried to warn them. The intelligence was accurate. The failure was on the German side, not his. Any lingering doubt about Arabelle's reliability was washed away by this demonstration of commitment. Second, and this is the part that changed history, he created the emotional leverage he needed for what came next. Because the real deception hadn't happened yet. Everything up to this point, the 27 agents, the 500 messages, the phantom army, the inflatable tanks, all of it was prologue. The climax of the entire Garbo operation, the message that would determine the outcome of the war, was still 3 days away. June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day. Allied forces were clinging to their beachheads by their fingernails. At Omaha, the Americans had advanced barely a mile inland. The hedgerow country of Normandy was turning every field into a killing ground. German counterattacks were intensifying. The outcome was anything but certain. In the house on Crespigny Road, Pujol and Harris sat together for 6 intense hours, crafting the most important document either of them would ever write. The message was long, detailed, and urgent. It demanded immediate transmission to the highest levels of German command, and it said something that, if the Germans believed it, would paralyze them at the most critical moment of the war. It said, "Normandy is a diversion." Garbo's analysis, supposedly based on reports from agents across Britain, presented a comprehensive picture. The forces that had landed in Normandy were secondary. The main Allied army, FUSAG, under General Patton, remained concentrated in southeast England. The real invasion, larger, more powerful, aimed at the Pas de Calais, was still coming. The logic was exquisite. Look at the forces that have landed in Normandy, the message argued. They are substantial, yes, but they represent only a fraction of Allied strength in Britain. Where are the rest? Where is Patton? Where is the 1st United States Army Group? The answer, according to Garbo, waiting for the Germans to commit their reserves to Normandy. And the moment those reserves move south, the hammer will fall at Calais. The message was transmitted to Madrid. Madrid retransmitted it to Berlin. And from Berlin, it traveled up through the chain of command with extraordinary speed. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel read it. Colonel General Alfred Jodl analyzed it. It reached Adolf Hitler himself at Berchtesgaden. 2 days after the message was sent, a German transmission back to Madrid confirmed its impact in language that must have made Garbo and Harris's hearts stop. All reports received in the last week from the Arabelle network have been confirmed without exception and are to be described as especially valuable, without exception. Especially valuable. The Germans had swallowed it whole. The response was immediate and decisive. The 15th Army at Calais, over 200,000 men, would remain in position. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which had already begun moving toward Normandy, was ordered to halt. The 116th Panzer Division stayed in reserve north of the Seine. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, had argued desperately for moving forces to Normandy as early as June 8th. Hitler, influenced by Garbo's report, refused. The Phantom Army could not be ignored. Week after week, as Allied forces consolidated their bridgehead, expanded their perimeter, and built up for the breakout, German forces sat at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions held in place by a message written in a suburban house in North London. 7 weeks. That is how long the Germans waited before the High Command finally accepted that Calais was not the target. 7 weeks during which the Allies poured men, equipment, and supplies into Normandy, establishing a foothold that could not be dislodged. The Allies had hoped fortitude might buy them 2 weeks. 7 was beyond their wildest dreams. Think about what those 7 weeks meant in human terms. Every day the 15th Army sat at Calais was another day the Allies could reinforce without facing the full weight of German power. Every division that stayed idle at Pas de Calais was a division that wasn't killing Allied soldiers in the hedgerows of Normandy. Military historians have debated the exact numbers, but the consensus is clear. Operation Fortitude, with Garbo at its center, saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Soldiers who stormed the beaches, who fought through the bocage, who broke out in Operation Cobra, many of them owed their survival to a Spanish double agent they would never know existed. And on the German side, the cost was catastrophic. Rommel, the Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated field commander, watched helplessly as his outnumbered forces in Normandy were ground down. He had begged for reinforcements. He had argued that Normandy was the real invasion. He was overruled by Hitler, who trusted Agent Arabelle over his own field marshal. Rommel, the legendary commander who had outfought the British across North Africa, was ultimately defeated not by Allied tanks or bombers, but by fictional intelligence from a Barcelona chicken farmer. And then came the final, exquisite irony. On July 29, 1944, as Allied armies surged across France in the aftermath of Operation Cobra, a message arrived from Germany for Agent Arabelle. It informed him that he had been awarded the Iron Cross, second class, by the Führer himself for extraordinary services to the German Reich. Hitler had personally authorized Germany's prestigious military decoration for a British double agent who had just ensured the Third Reich's defeat. By return message, Pujol and Harris expressed Garbo's humble thanks for such an honor for which he was truly unworthy. Unworthy, the understatement of the century. Later that year, in a secret ceremony on November 25, 1944, King George VI awarded Juan Pujol Garcia the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for the same actions. He became one of the very few people in history to receive high decorations from both sides in the same war. The Iron Cross and the MBE, pinned to the same invisible lapel, awarded for the same act of deception that had helped doom one side and save the other. Even after the Normandy breakout, the deception continued. Garbo's network kept sending messages, maintaining the fiction even as the Third Reich crumbled. Some agents reported on fictional communist infiltration in Allied armies. Others described tensions between American and British forces. The Germans never stopped believing. Even as Berlin fell, even as the Wehrmacht surrendered, German intelligence files showed they still considered the Garbo network their most reliable source of intelligence from Britain. The greatest con in military history ran for 4 straight years, and the victims never caught on, but the war was ending. The Third Reich was dying, and Juan Pujol Garcia, the man who had created an army of ghosts, was about to face a very different kind of challenge. Because the Nazis might be finished, but there were still people out there who would want revenge on the spy who had fooled them, and Pujol's only defense, the wall of secrecy that had protected him throughout the war, was about to become his prison. The greatest double agent of World War II was about to disappear. And this time, the deception wouldn't just be about fooling the Germans. It would be about fooling the entire world, including his own children. Part 5 plus verdict. The Ghost Who Lived. September 1944. The war was winding down, but Garbo's work wasn't finished. Following a scare that Pujol was about to be exposed as a British double agent, MI5 decided he should go to ground. The fiction was maintained that Garbo had to flee Britain, fearing arrest by British authorities who were closing in on his network. His sub-agents continued reporting, maintaining the deception even in the final months of the war. The last message from the Garbo network was dated May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. It reported that Agent 3, the Venezuelan student who had never existed, had been arrested by British counterintelligence. A fake arrest of a fictional agent, reported to an intelligence service that would cease to exist within days. It was a fitting final act for the most elaborate fiction of the 20th century. After the German surrender, Pujol faced a new enemy, time. As the details of Nazi atrocities became public, as Nuremberg prepared to try the architects of the Holocaust, surviving intelligence officers scattered across Europe. Some sought anonymity, Some sought revenge. Pujol feared reprisals from former Nazis, the men who had funded and trusted Agent Arabelle. The ones who hadn't been captured or killed were out there somewhere. And if they ever learned the truth about the spy who had cost them the war, a chicken farmer in London would be an easy target. MI5 helped him craft one final deception. In 1949, Pujol traveled to Angola. Word was put out that he had contracted malaria and died. The British ambassador in Madrid personally delivered the news to Araceli, his estranged wife. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, Agent Arabelle, the man who had invented 27 fictional spies and deceived the entire German military machine, was officially dead. He wasn't dead, of course. He was in Venezuela. He settled in Lagunielas, a small town far from the world stage where he had once performed. He taught English to local employees of the Shell Oil Company. Later, he opened a small bookstore and gift shop called La Casa del Regalo. He married again, a woman named Carmen Celia, and started a new family. 2 sons, Carlos Miguel and Joan Carlos, and a daughter who would die tragically young in 1975. For 36 years, Juan Pujol Garcia lived in quiet anonymity. His neighbors knew him as a pleasant, unremarkable Spaniard who ran a small shop. His customers had no idea they were buying stationery from the man who had changed the course of World War II. Even his own children from his first marriage, the ones he had left behind in Spain, believed their father was dead. Think about that. The man who had created the most successful fictional characters in intelligence history was now living as a fictional character himself. The chicken farmer who had invented 27 imaginary lives was now living an imaginary life of his own. The irony would have made even Garbo's creators pause, the secret held for decades. The double-cross system remained classified. The techniques of strategic deception, the identities of the agents, the full scope of Operation Fortitude, all of it stayed locked in government files. The men who had been deceived went to their graves without knowing the full truth. Karl Erich Kuhlenthal returned to Germany after his interrogation at Bad Mondorf. He lived quietly, working in business, carrying the knowledge that his greatest intelligence triumph had been his most catastrophic failure. Whether he ever fully accepted the truth is unknown. Some who knew him said he continued to insist that Arabelle must have had some real agents, that the entire network couldn't have been fictional. The details were too precise, too accurate. He could not bring himself to believe that one man's imagination had been more powerful than the entire German intelligence apparatus. Kuhlenthal died on October 25, 1975. He was 71 years old. Whatever peace he found in those final decades, he found it carrying a wound that never fully healed. And then, in 1984, a British writer and politician named Rupert Allison, writing under the pen name Nigel West, decided to find out if Agent Garbo was still alive. Allison had spent years interviewing former intelligence officers, piecing together the Garbo story, but none of them knew Garbo's real name. The secret had been kept that tightly. Eventually, Anthony Blunt, the Soviet spy who had penetrated MI5 during the war, revealed that he had met Garbo and knew him as either Juan or José Garcia. That was something. But Garcia is one of the most common names in Spain. The investigation stalled. Then, in March 1984, a former MI5 officer who had served in Spain provided Pujol's full name. Allison hired a research assistant who began calling every J. Garcia in the Barcelona phone book, an exercise in patience that makes modern internet searches feel like cheating. Eventually, the assistant reached Pujol's nephew, and through him, Allison arranged a meeting with the man himself. On May 20th, 1984, Rupert Allison met Juan Pujol Garcia in New Orleans. The greatest double agent of World War II was 72 years old. He was running a gift shop in Caracas. He had been officially dead for 35 years. The revelation stunned the intelligence world. They collaborated on an autobiography, Operation Garbo, published in 1985, and Allison urged Pujol to come back to England. Pujol agreed. In 1984, Juan Pujol Garcia returned to London for the first time since the war. The city had changed beyond recognition. The bomb sites were gone. The blackout curtains were gone. The wartime urgency that had driven him and Harris to create their masterpiece, that was gone too. At Buckingham Palace, in a private ceremony, the Duke of Edinburgh welcomed him and thanked him on behalf of the nation. The audience lasted far longer than protocol normally allowed. There was much to discuss. Afterward, Pujol visited the Special Forces Club, where he was reunited with a group of his former MI5 colleagues, men he hadn't seen in 40 years, men who had studied his case for decades without knowing if he was still alive. He visited 35 Crespigny Road in Hendon, the modest house where he and Harris had spent thousands of hours crafting the fiction that saved D-Day. A family was living there now. They had no idea their home had been the nerve center of one of the war's most crucial operations. Veterans of D-Day, learning for the first time about the deception that had saved many of their lives, lined up to shake his hand. Men who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, who had fought through the hedgerows, who had survived because German reinforcements never came. They looked at this small, quiet, elderly Spaniard and struggled to comprehend what he had done. Perhaps the most striking moment came when Pujol was shown the German intelligence files from the war, page after page of reports, analysis, commendations, all based on his fiction, payment receipts for agents who never existed, operational orders built on his deceptions, the entire architecture of German intelligence failure, preserved in meticulous German documentation. Did they really believe it all? Pujol asked his former colleagues. Every word, came the reply. They believed every word. At a reunion dinner in London with surviving MI5 officers, Pujol was asked what had motivated him to undertake such a dangerous deception. His answer was simple. I wanted to do something good for humanity. The Nazis were evil. I had seen enough in Spain to know that. If my imagination, my ability to create stories, could help defeat them, then that was my contribution. I had no gun, no bombs, no army, but I had the ability to make the Germans believe whatever I told them. That was my weapon. He paused, and then added with a slight smile, and it worked, didn't it? They believed every word. Now let us return to where we began. That interrogation room in Bad Mondorf, May 1945. The British officer had spent nearly an hour laying out the evidence for Karl Erich Kuhlenthal. Document after document, message after message, the 27 agents, the 500 radio transmissions, the 62 reports that reached Hitler's desk, the divisions held at Calais, the panzer reserves frozen in place, the 7 weeks of paralysis that sealed the fate of the Third Reich, and then the final revelation. Every single agent was fictional, all of them, created by one man and his British handler, working from a house in suburban London. Kuhlenthal sat in silence for a long time. The cigarette in his hand had burned down to his fingers. Finally, he asked a single question. The June 9th message, the one that said, Normandy was a diversion, did that come from London? From a house in Hendon, the interrogator confirmed. Written by Garbo and his handler over 6 hours. Transmitted by radio to Madrid. Retransmitted by you to Berlin. It reached Hitler himself. Kuhlenthal nodded slowly. Then we lost the war on June 9th, 1944. The interrogator corrected him gently. You lost the war the day you believed Agent Arabelle was real. Here is the final accounting. The numbers that define the scope of the greatest intelligence deception in history. 27 completely fictional agents, created and maintained over 4 years. Over 500 radio messages sent between January and June 1944 alone. 315 letters throughout the war, averaging 2,000 words each. Approximately $340,000 in 1940s currency, paid by German intelligence to fund agents who never existed. 62 Garbo reports included in Wehrmacht High Command intelligence summaries. The German 15th Army, over 200,000 men, held at the Pas de Calais for 7 weeks after D-Day. Multiple panzer divisions kept away from Normandy at the most critical moments of the invasion. The mathematics of deception had created a strategic paralysis that allowed the Allies to win the war in Europe. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The deeper question, the one that intelligence services around the world still study today, is how. How did one man, with no training, no resources, and no particular qualifications, deceive an entire intelligence apparatus for 4 years? Part of the answer lies in the corruption of the system itself. The Abwehr rewarded officers who produced intelligence, not officers who verified it. Kuhlenthal's career depended on Arabelle being real, so he never looked too closely at inconsistencies. Berlin needed intelligence from Britain, so they never questioned their only reliable source. The deception succeeded because everyone involved had reasons to believe it. Part of the answer lies in German psychology. The Nazi regime, built on propaganda and self-deception, was peculiarly vulnerable to believing what it wanted to believe. They expected to have spies in Britain. When Garbo appeared, they accepted him. They expected the Allies to invade at Calais. When Garbo confirmed it, they believed him. But the deepest answer lies in the artistry of the deception. Garbo and Harris didn't just send intelligence, they created a world with messy humanity, romantic entanglements, financial problems, personality conflicts, petty jealousies. The fictional agents felt real because they behaved like real people, not like characters in a spy novel. They made mistakes. They complained about their pay. They got drunk and said things they shouldn't have. The deception was so audacious that suspecting it required an imaginative leap the German intelligence services proved incapable of making. Who would imagine that 27 agents were all fictional? Who would believe that Germany's most productive intelligence network was run by a single man in suburban London? The answer: nobody. Because the truth was more unbelievable than the fiction. Juan Pujol Garcia died on October 10, 1988, in Caracas, Venezuela. He was 76 years old. His death from a stroke made headlines around the world. The chicken farmer who fooled Hitler, the spy who saved D-Day, the man who created an army of ghosts. He is buried in Choroní, Venezuela. His gravestone reads simply, Juan Pujol Garcia, 14th of February 12, 10th of October, 88. Remembered by: no mention of Agent Garbo, no mention of Agent Arabelle, no mention of the 27 fictional agents, or the 500 messages, or the Iron Cross, or the MBE. No mention of the fact that this unremarkable man, lying in this quiet grave, had helped save Western civilization, with nothing but his imagination. Tommy Harris, his partner in deception, was killed in a suspicious car accident in Mallorca on January 27, 1964. He was 55. His wife survived the crash, but could never explain why their car had suddenly swerved into a tree. Some believe Soviet agents silenced him before MI5 could question him about his connections to the Cambridge Five. Others think it was simply a terrible accident. The truth died with him on a road in Lukmaja. The Garbo network, 27 characters who never existed, yet who changed the course of history, lives on in declassified files, in books, in a small exhibit at the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth, where visitors learn for the first time about the Spanish double agent who helped their grandfathers survive. But perhaps the most fitting memorial exists in the imagination itself, because that is where the Garbo network was born, in the mind of a chicken farmer who sat in a Lisbon cafe with a tourist guide and decided to invent a world so real that an entire nation believed it, a world so powerful that it defeated armies, changed strategies, and saved tens of thousands of lives, a world so complete that even after the truth was revealed, some of the men who had been deceived still could not accept it. There must have been some real agents, one former Abwehr officer insisted when shown the evidence decades after the war. Arabelle couldn't have invented everything. When shown the proof, the handwritten messages, the MI5 files, the payment records for fictional people, he fell silent. Then quietly, he said, "Then we never had a chance." No, they never did. Because they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't detect, an enemy that existed only in the imagination of a man they had trusted with the fate of the Third Reich. The Germans never knew that Agent Garbo had fed them false invasion plans. They never knew that their most reliable spy was their greatest enemy. They never knew that the intelligence they built their strategy on was fiction, written by a chicken farmer and an art dealer's son in a modest house in North London. They never knew, and by the time they learned the truth, it was far, far too late. The war was over. The Reich was destroyed. and Agent Garbo had entered history as perhaps the most successful double agent who ever lived, the spy who won D-Day with nothing more than imagination, determination, and the German willingness to believe what they desperately wanted to be true. If you found this deep dive valuable, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm this content is worth sharing, and it helps us bring more untold stories from history to people who deserve to know them. The next chapter is already being written, and trust me, some of the stories we have coming make this one look like a warm-up. I'll see you in the comments. And remember, in intelligence, as in war, perception can be more powerful than reality. The Germans didn't lose because they lacked intelligence. They lost because they trusted the wrong intelligence completely. They were defeated not by armies or weapons, but by imagination and deception on a scale they never conceived possible.